Every story has a beginning, every trip a starting point. We're up in Washington State for a look at the start of not only the Oregon Trunk subdivision, but where trains start their 800-mile trip to Fresno. We're on Highway 14, driving along the busy Fallbridge sub, skirting the Columbia River. A worthwhile pause en route to Wishram came here to catch a unique work train hauling a rail crane westward. Above Wishram, the gorge sprawls out like a blue carpet, and across the way in Oregon, an interstate, the Union Pacific, a highway, and the Oregon Trunk's first few miles are seen. Wishram has a small yard, which is only a shell of its previous significance, when it was a division point, as evidenced by the empty yard tracks. Wishram is still home to the engineers and conductors of the Oregon Trunk Crew District working south to Bend. Also, Amtrak makes a stop at a small station here. But little else is going on when trains aren't coming or going from the trunk. The BNSF Fallbridge main line, however, sees a constant parade of trains of every type imaginable. Having exited tunnel number 12, the area to the right of the train used to be known as Clark, which ferried Oregon trunk trains across the Columbia until the bridge was constructed to the west. As a coal train races west, you may notice that gale force winds seem to be making the Columbia River flow backwards. The drawbridge over the Columbia River can be seen in the background where BN first sends trains south to Oregon. I have knowledge about an Oregon-bound train coming from Pasco Yard, so I'll be heading east to Maryhill to intercept it. However, this UP train caught my eye across the river. It has the UP 1943 leading, which honors our military. The railroad grade I'm driving on now is the old right-of-way for the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle before it was removed in 1959 to make way for the John Day Dam. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers project was so immense it demanded the relocation of 78 miles of right-of-way. This is the portion still visible above the water today. It was also the SP&S that ran the Oregon Trunk down to Bend. Spokane, Portland, and Seattle was one of 4 Hill-owned railroads that merged to form Burlington Northern in 1970, the others being the Great Northern, Northern Pacific, and Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy. It was in 1995 that the next major shift occurred. Burlington Northern and Santa Fe merged to create the largest railroad in America, the BNSF. I was hoping to find a place to capture the majestic gorge sprawling out behind the Oregon trunk-bound train, and I think I found a spot that captured just what I was looking for. I climbed above the cut we just saw, which is in the foreground, and to the right is the upper line in current use, just west of Maryhill. There is seldom a dull moment in the gorge. As another UP train races west from Canada, you can expect to see 60 trains a day between the Union Pacific and Burlington Northern Santa Fe. Leading the Oregon trunk-bound freight came a long, shiny crude oil train. The single hopper cars on either side of the train are called buffer cars. They provide a required layer of protection between the locomotives and the flammable liquids inside the tank cars. Only minutes behind the oil train and arriving ahead of schedule, my Pasco to Fresno train headlight appeared in the distance. This is an abbreviated run for the train crew, who on most occasions would be taking their train from Pasco all the way to Vancouver. Today, however, they'll be handing it off to a new crew at Wishram. I'm gonna head across the river at Berryhill and head to a spot I've had on my list a long time near Moody, Oregon, to catch the train again. But first, let's see the Columbia River crossing at OT Junction. It's a different day, and the wind is calm, making for a pleasant July morning above the action. UP still maintains a connection here, but they rarely run traffic through the junction since about 2005. Looking across the river, the daily Amtrak Empire Builder, train number 27, named in honor of James J. Hill, is picking up speed from its Wishram station stop. While the Portland section of the Empire Builder races west, the drawbridge remains up for an approaching tug barge. Meanwhile, an auto train waits for it to clear as a patch crew is climbing aboard. Several companies employ tug and barge operations on the Columbia River. The two main companies moving barges up the river are Shaver and Tidewater. It's a 48-hour trip by barge from Portland to Lewiston, Idaho at 7 knots, around 8.5 miles per hour. Each barge can handle up to 4,000 tons of freight, and they usually move in multiple. 10% of all American wheat will travel by barge over the Snake and Columbia Rivers. As impressive as that number is, 50% of America's wheat moves by rail through the gorge. Granite Point is one of 3 4,480 horsepower tugs built in 2015 by Vigor Industries of Portland for Tidewater transportation. The other two are named Crown Point and Ryan Point. With the tug clear, the bridge will drop to allow 2 trains to cross. While waiting for the northbound to get clearance, a southbound train arrives at Avery, where Oregon trunk trains from Vancouver crew change.
Passport BNSF 5720, dog catch crew on board, ready to go. Tried the Oregon trunk dispatcher, but no response. Thought I'd call you. That's right. Permission to proceed northbound, present location, over. Permission to proceed north, current location. Here we go. Signal indication there, etc.
Auto trains have been a regular sight recently over the line. which are headed for Portland. Trains crawl through mandatory slow-speed restricted track over the Columbia River drawbridge, which was first completed in 1912. Once the Dalles Dam was constructed, inundating Celilo Falls in 1954, the lift span was installed to permit the barge traffic that once used a canal on the opposite side of the river. On the Fallbridge sub, an eastbound is tying up the main line. Currently, there are 4 trains between Wishram and Avery. It's the final wait for this auto train before completing its trip on the inside gateway from the Bay Area. The short Vancouver to Fresno train has its clearance and heads on to the Y. This train is in for a bit of excitement ahead in its trip, which we will see later. I was just curious about all those old hoppers on the head end of the train. It looks like a recent track rehabilitation project has these old hoppers in charge of a retired lot of railroad ties, headed perhaps to a specialized center for turning them into biofuel or landscape material. Their creosote treatment necessitates consideration for safe repurposing considering environmental and health hazards. Old ties can be chipped or shredded and burned in specialized power plants for generating heat and electricity. Some old ties even have enough life left in them to be reused by secondary lines and regional carriers. I've climbed the hill above the line at Moody before the tracks turn alongside the Deschutes River, which meets the Columbia here near Biggs Junction. The stunning rock outcropping is pierced by Tunnel Number 1, as the tracks were constructed high on the canyon wall here. That was because the Deschutes River was being considered for a dam project near the end of the canyon, a project which never came to be. An empty potash train below is headed for the air sub at Hinkle, a train I reluctantly filmed as my camera was trained on the tunnel, expecting the southbound I saw at Maryhill at any moment. Having come from OT Junction this morning, I drove south and at Maupin hit the old Deschutes Railroad grade and drove as far south as allowable to this beautiful spot. Waiting for the Vancouver to Fresno train, my work radio was tuned into the AAR channel for the trunk, and an interesting conversation started between the dispatcher and the conductor.
Proceed, but you got a damaged cow catcher. Is it bent like in any way that goes off track or anything, or is it might just, I mean, can you proceed, or do we need to replace it, or what? But did you do any damage to the rock? Oh. 56.30. That's all right, brother. If I hit a big old rock and I lived through it, I'd be getting my charge warned around too. Yeah, but no whiskey came out, right? All right, brother. Well, keep on keeping on, then. I'll pass it on to the big dogs and go out there and take a look. If he's fetching.
Though my small radio only picked up the dispatcher, it was clear what happened. One of the notorious perils of the canyon had struck again, falling rock, and apparently one big enough to bend the steel plow. A sharp eye can see the damage center right on the bottom of the cowcatcher, the old school term I love that the dispatcher used. The train was delayed and blocked, referring to when a train stops between signals. When it was determined it was safe to proceed, it must do so at restricted speed, which is a speed slow enough to stop within half of the range of vision, until it passes the next signal. Fortunately, the rock was either broken apart or not large enough to derail the train. Large objects between the rails also have a tendency to knock air hoses apart, causing an emergency application of the air brakes. Trains today are much heavier than the old days, and this same situation could have been deadly in the early 20th century. To inspect the line and check on damage to the tracks, high-rail trucks will be sent out with track inspectors. Periods of heavy rain are especially bad for subjecting the right-of-way to loosened rocks. I moved a little distance north, close to the location of the offending rock near Maupin, while rafters enjoyed the rolling river. Right around that corner is a place called Boxcar Rapids, which earned the name in tragedy. Known before as Wapanita Rapids, in January 1954, one of the worst Oregon trunk disasters occurred when engineer Ernie Barton and fireman Earl Sutton, at the throttle of engine number 857, hit a rock slide, sending 3 diesel locomotives and a couple cars into the swollen waters, while a dozen boxcars derailed and wedged into the cut. The challenging location hindered the rescue effort, and it was weeks before the locomotive was able to be lifted up from the raging waters, with engineer Barton inside. Fireman Sutton's body took much longer to locate, miles downstream from Maupin. It seems uncanny that this very day a train was reminded of this dark chapter at the same location. Though today the rocks haven't stopped the flow of trains, something else might. The sky has been getting ever more smoky due to a fire near Madras threatening the railroad. A special firefighting train has been called up to protect the area. A Wishram crew is clearing up in Maupin, collecting more water cars for the job. In the meantime, the dispatcher is job briefing a northbound who is short on hours to work.
Yeah, you're gonna come on down to Shear and tighten down on the main line. Van's gonna meet you there, 1800 over. Just make sure you don't block words there in there. He got himself out of breath getting in the clear for y'all and mopping up. Stampede man, yeah.
Through it all, the dispatcher hasn't lost his sense of humor.
Answering Maupin radio, over. 234, over.
I understand BNSF 8246, all by your point of entry, correct?
Yes, sir, BNSF 8246, that's your point of entry.
BNSF 7120, give authority enter main track. Milepost 234 for southward movement, over.
BNSF 7120 South, has authority to enter main track, milepost 54.234 for a southward movement, over.
That's correct, over.
Yes, sir, that's correct. We'll let you know that's all buttoned up. Thank you, sir.
These days, a caboose is always a great thing to see. It takes a lot to keep a railroad running. While trucks enjoy the use of highways built and maintained by tax dollars, railroads pay for the maintenance of their routes all on their own. Further south, we see the old Oregon Trunk right-of-way crossing Trout Creek, abandoned since 1923 when the SP&S began using the UP from South Junction to Metolius. And on that section of UP-built track is a beautiful spot before Gateway. It was a long hike to get here, but I found it was well worth it.
Oregon Gateway dispatcher, BNSF 6697 south, over. Has to see if y'all can comply with the 30 mph in the same location that 15 mph is from milepost 84.5 to milepost 84.9, over. Did y'all happen to get that Form A 3823, over? Thank you. Oregon Gateway dispatcher up.
Based on those mileposts the dispatcher was giving the train, for a slow order north of my current location, I knew a southbound would be struggling up the 1.5% grade soon. I find it somewhat funny and ironic that arguably Union Pacific's most impressive construction in Oregon of all the amazing route mileage built in the state is this stretch of the Oregon Trunk between South Junction and Metolius. And today, you wouldn't even know it was ever a UP line. Though 1.5% doesn't sound like much, for a railroad, it's a lot to overcome. It's not as steep as the Blues or SP's old Pinker Pass over the Cascades, but this is BNSF's steepest challenge in Oregon. As most regular viewers of my channel know, I am a conductor with Union Pacific. On a recent trip home, I met a BNSF Inside Gateway train at Calamus that was unique. It was a loaded Department of Defense military train with everything from Hummers to tanks. I found out this was part of a multi-train movement of equipment to California. So I headed out as soon as I possibly could to find one. As luck had it, I was able to chase this one from Twin Crossings to Opal City on a gorgeous August day full of traffic. following 30 minutes behind was a long manifest that really was the icing on the cake at this location. I'd tried before to get this shot to no avail, so it felt very satisfying to not only capture a shot I'd wanted, but to know now I had multiple trains to chase toward Bend. Empty center beams don't typically go south, so their presence next to the unique flexi-beam flat car makes me think that they may be destined to be set out for the Bend local to take to customers in Central Oregon. Chapter 2 may be coming to a close, but there's a lot coming down the pike, so keep your ear to the rail, friends.